courtesy of Simon, our chairman, I have the title of Honorary Historian of Kitchener Scholars Association. So in that capacity, I'm speaking to you tonight briefly about Lord Kitchener, where he came from, what he was doing, what he was up to in Palestine. And my colleague, Felicity, in this endeavour, is going to give you a much more of a context of the historical environment in which this was operated. So my first thing is just to, rather than jump straight in to the work that Kitchener did in Palestine, just tell you a bit about his boyhood and early life before we get into the actual work within Palestine. So, Horatio Herbert Kitchener is called Horatio because of Lord Nelson, who was a neighbour in East Anglia, where his family came from. I'm going to explain his early life in school and education, and then in the army. So he was actually born in Ireland, despite the fact the family were from East Anglia. The father, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Horatio Kitchener, and his mother, Frances Chevalier, who was a clergyman's daughter, they originated in East Anglia. And at that time, around 1850, just before that, his father, Henry, resigned from the army and moved the whole family over to Ireland, where he bought not one but two houses. The fact was that in those days, Ireland was in pretty poor shape after the various famines and economic crises. And so property was available. So they bought property. And that's where Kitchener was born and where he lived. His father never saw active service, actually. He could have done in the 1850s. You had the Crimean War and the Indian Uprising, but he wasn't involved in that. He preferred to live and work in Ireland. So the family led a comfortable country life, probably a little bit apart from the indigenous population, as was the habit in those days. The children roamed and indulged themselves in pursuits like riding, swimming, and country tasks like cutting peat and the rest of it. Father Henry was a slightly eccentric, well, more than slightly eccentric person who didn't really believe in schools, so he hired private tutors to educate his children. This led to a pretty mixed result in terms of the quality of the education that the children received, including that by Herbert, as I will now call him more through the thing. And I believe that the education they received was rudimentary at best. And life was simple, self-contained, little mixing outside the family circle. And Herbert became markedly reserved, actually, and I think elements of that remained with him for the rest of his life. But then everything changed all the time in this family. His mother, sadly, became infected with lung problems. And Henry suddenly lifted up the whole family, sold these two houses in Ireland, and moved to Montreux in Switzerland, where the family was set up for the next part of their history. Regrettably, that didn't do what was expected in terms of helping to cure mother's problems, and she passed away. And at that moment, Henry, the father, developed a liking for the music mistress they had, and went off with her and decided to move to New Zealand, of all places. So this is quite an extraordinary story that I'm telling you. So Herbert and his brothers were left in Switzerland, really to fend for themselves. They were put under the supervision of a tutor, and they moved around various educational institutions. One was a private school, but Herbert became completely fluent in French, pretty good at maths, but apart from that, that was all there was. And he was quite lonely and shy, and he'd lost his settled family life that I'd explained in Ireland was fairly close. So these experiences were leaving their mark. So he took life into his own hands and decided that he wanted to join the Royal Engineers, as one does. He decided that's the way forward. And he decided not to go for the elitist approach to army life. He did not want to join a cavalry regiment or an infantry regiment. He wanted to go into the Royal Engineers. So he was sent to the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich, very near here, known as the Shop for those people like Mervyn who are Royal Engineers. We've got one or two here in the room. And the Shop trained people for the artillery and the engineers. And actually, if you go to Woolwich now, and it's up the hill, it's not down on the river, you'll find a very splendid building, which is the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich, where he was stationed for a few years in his education. And the Shop trained sappers and artillerymen in both technology and military fighting skills. General Gordon, who in later life Kitchener was to avenge the death of Gordon, he was also a Royal Engineer. To get into this Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, Kitchener had to struggle a bit, so he went to a crammer. This was, I think they probably still exist, these things, but and certainly I remember them from my days at school. Some people, happy to say I didn't, but went to crammers, and he did. And he met a man called Claude Condor, and you're going to hear more about him later, because Condor and Kitchener's life intersected quite strongly in our story. Anyway, during this time, he grew to a 6'2". He was handsome. He wasn't interested in team games. He never went to public school. He didn't have that ethos of playing rugby and cricket and all those things. He was much more interested in swimming and riding. He was quite impulsive and natural. I don't think he was reserved in some ways about what he spoke about or what he said, because he wasn't used to the strictures of a public school orthodox education. Anyway, he passed the exam. He wasn't the top, he wasn't the bottom. And there he studied mathematics, geometry, chemistry, surveying, and drill. This was for him his university. He never went to university. This was the closest he got to getting a degree. And he developed during this time a very strong interest in high church Christianity, what we call Anglo-Catholicism, which at the time was quite controversial. I mean, the Church of England became quite split with these movements. And he became very keen on this. And he had friends in the army with whom he worked together to convert or to attract people into that branch of Christianity. He added to his French some German. He learned Hebrew with Condor. Later he added Arabic and Turkic. So one thing he could do is speak languages. He completed all of that in December 1870. And by then, of course, he was due to get his commission. But while he was on holiday, by the way, his father had come, that story goes on and on, decided to come back from New Zealand and set up a house in Brittany, in Dinan, where he lived. And Kitchener used to go there for holidays to see their dad. They weren't on bad terms, it was just their paths didn't cross perhaps as much as you would expect. So he came together with him, and he had the idea, we were in 1871, what was happening then? Franco-Prussian War. He decided to go and do a bit of tourism in the area of Le Mans. Don't think he actually officially signed up, but he turned up. He went up in a hot air balloon, he got pneumonia doing it. But then the army found out that he'd been sort of AWOL doing this, and his commission came through while he was over in Brittany. And when they found out, they said, you've broken every regulation that exists in terms of what an officer is allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And at that time, he was put in front of the Duke of Cambridge. You might have heard of this chap. As a member of the royal family and was the commander-in-chief of the army for many, many years, decades. But anyway, he was admonished, but he managed to get away with it and was sort of given a warning. Don't do that sort of thing again. Don't get into a foreign theatre of war just on a whim. Probably didn't make much difference, because later I've got stories about him going off to have get involved in other wars going on in Bulgaria and other places. Anyway, from that, what I'm suggesting is he was always interested in experiencing opportunities that were around him to broaden his experience, to broaden his knowledge of the world. And there are other little episodes. He had, after the commission was awarded, he was in the he was a lieutenant by then. There he is. By then, he had to go to Chatham, where there was more training. But after he had an adventure out in Austria, where he went to Vienna to witness some manoeuvres he was attached to a general who was going from the British Army. He sat next to the Emperor Franz Joseph and sort of started hobnobbing with him. So, it was quite a colourful period. Anyway, he remembered his mate Condor, and when the Palestine Exploration Fund were looking to replace the number 2 of Condor, who was actually living at that time in Palestine, he applied for it, he got the job, it ticked a lot of boxes for him. It clearly played to his interest in surveying, because the Royal Engineers are the mapping service of the UK forces, still are in many ways. It ticked a lot of boxes. He wanted to be part of this world of the Middle East, the Near East, and this mission came to his attention and he took it. So at that point, that's just a little background of his life. And now I'm going to hand over to Felicity to set the scene in Palestine.
Thank you very much, Charles. An interesting start to an interesting life. And we're going to go on a little holiday now, I think, to Palestine. So here we are. What is Palestine? Now, I'm not going to talk about Palestine in the modern context, about how we understand it or we don't understand it today, about how different people feel about it or anything like this. This is purely a historical and, most importantly, actually a geographical kind of definition. The first time that the phrase comes into use is in connection with a group of people called the Peleset in Egyptian sources in the 12th century BC. And these people enter into the Bible as the Philistines. So they're the people we know in the Bible as the Philistines. They settle after some battles with the Egyptians, who are in control, who have an empire in the Levant at that time. The Philistines, the Peleset, settle in this area here of the southern Levant. And very, very quickly, their material culture, which is very distinctive, after a couple of hundred of years, though, it's kind of disappeared. The people have been absorbed into the overall local population. And the term Philistine, or in terms of a regional area, Philistia, becomes not so much associated with a group of people at all, but with a region. And it becomes applied to the whole region very quickly. We see it appear in Assyrian sources in the 8th century BC, where it's Palashtu or Pilishtu, and then again in Herodotus in the 5th century BC. So this terminology has form, it has a history, and it's been around for a long time. It's a geographical term, much in the same way that we would say the British Isles to describe our collection of nations. That's what its context is. In terms of the area, it kind of expands and contracts depending on who's doing the measuring, who's doing the defining, and perhaps who's in charge as well. At its greatest extent, you can see it going down through the Sinai Peninsula, up as far as Damascus, inland as far as where the desert begins in Jordan, and of course in the west, it's the Mediterranean Sea. So that's its area. So if you can think, it's basically the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean. Syria occupies the northern half, Palestine occupies the southern half. And that is where we are. It's also more or less contiguous with the European concept of the Holy Land. And this is really important for the kind of multiple intertwined interests of the founders of the Palestine Exploration Fund, who we're going to come on to now. So in terms of what the landscapes are like, it's incredibly varied. It's really, really hilly. And what this means is that you get lots of little microclimates. In one area it can be desert, in another area it can be beautiful Mediterranean Arcadia, in another place it's subtropical. So you have a lot of different environments for growing different kinds of crops, different kinds of lifestyles as well. So it makes it also quite difficult to survey. And the people. The people of Palestine, and there were people there, a lot of them, We have Muslim Arabs, Christian Arabs. They're the two main groups. The Muslim Arabs are by far the largest group of people. Palestinians, we would call them. We would call all these people Palestinians, to be honest with you. Palestinian Armenians, Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Bedouin. They are all Palestinians because they live in Palestine. So it's a real kind of collective of different groups who self-identify in different ways, but we collectively identify them as Palestinians. And there are also people who have been brought in from around the Ottoman Empire to settle. So we have Kurds and Circassians, Bosnian populations. We also have even Algerian populations at certain places resettled in Palestine. And of course, there are the Ottoman Turks, often the people who were in charge of various administrative posts, and the odd European who's gallivanting around. Okay, so this is the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. It's quite big, isn't it? There's a lot of it. And this is the area that we're associated with today. And this is what it would look like. In terms of how it was organised in the Ottoman Empire, Palestine as a region, it didn't exist as a name, Palestine as a kind of official designation. Again, it's just that geographical term. And it was split up into kind of administrative areas called wilayats. And I do apologise to any Ottoman specialists for getting a lot of this very wrong, I'm sure. But the two main administrative centres for Palestine in the middle of the 19th century were Beirut in the northern part and Jerusalem in the southern part. Those are the two kind of centres for negotiations and sorting out your paperwork and customs and so on and so forth. In terms of what the Ottoman Empire meant to Europeans, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I know this is going to be something that you're going to talk about, but basically the Europeans saw the Ottoman Empire as a bit of a kind of grand old man, maybe a bit doddery, which is perhaps a little bit unfair, but they had a lot of strategic concerns at that particular time. In the north, there was an aggressive Russia who was kind of expanding and wanting to take over territories. In the south, there was the strategically important Suez Canal. And these were two large strategic concerns for a lot of different Western powers that really motivated them to see Palestine as perhaps a significant area for the first time. We also have the religious connection of Palestine as the Holy Land. And here we have the interesting setup where there are kind of European religious organisations setting up like almost little kind of kingdoms in the Holy City that have almost complete autonomy within their own little circle. So little Vatican cities all over the place. So Palestine was very crucial as a strategic part of the world, but the West didn't really understand or know much about it at this stage in history. So there were pilgrim trails and the pilgrim routes and the usual places got visited. So Church of the Holy Sepulchre and Nazareth and Bethlehem and all these places. But, what's in between? How do these places connect up? Outside of those pilgrimage routes, very little was known. And outside of those interests of the pilgrims, also very little was known about the country, its people, its heritage, its landscapes, its climate, and so on and so forth. And a lot of people felt, for a strategic part of the world, this is perhaps a bit of a problem. So, a year before the founding of the PEF, there was this project, the Ordnance Survey of Jerusalem. And it starts off as kind of like the Victorian philanthropists' kind of ideal project to get clean water supply for the Holy City. What can be more noble than that? Absolutely wonderful. Angela Burdett Coutts is one of the main sponsors of this project. And this chap here, George Grove, who is a civil engineer, we're going to come across him a lot more in a moment. George Grove says to her, but if you want clean water for a holy city, you need to have a survey first. And so he convinces her to give £500, which is a lot of money in them days, to conduct a survey of the old city of Jerusalem. And the survey was conducted by this chap down here, Captain Charles Wilson of the Royal Engineers. George Grove is a civil engineer and he knows lots and lots of Royal Engineers. That's a really important connection. Okay, so the following year, the PEF is founded. The Ordnance Survey generates a lot of interest in this part of the world. And these two men, George Grove, who we've already met, and Dean Arthur Stanley of Westminster, are the two people who are at the forefront of this drive to found a new society, the job of which is to collate information, data, material about this part of the world that nobody really understands very well. The really important thing about them is that they are incredibly well connected. They're like, they know, their little black books were like a who's who of the Victorian world. Everybody. So George Grove is a musicologist, he's a civil engineer, but he's also a Hebrew scholar and he works with Dean Arthur Stanley. Dean Arthur Stanley is an incredibly important cleric. He has the ear of Queen Victoria, but he's also mates with Thomas Huxley, who's a Darwinian scientist. So incredibly broad spread of connections and interests from the political corridors of power right through to social reformers and ideological thinkers and scientists. So bearing that in mind, they're able to kind of tap in, not just into one interest group. I'm interested in, understanding Hebrew weights more, but also into all those strategic interests and all those scientific interests and all those religious interests and pool them so that the new society is much, much more than the sum of any one single part. And as such, it has this huge kind of breadth of support, much more so than you would expect for the study of a part of the world, which is a rather small area a long way away. Their model was to create a society whereby the data that was collected could be relied upon. Really, really important. No matter who's using the material, can you rely on this material? And their model was this chap, Dr. Edward Robinson, who invented, I suppose, the study of biblical historical geography. And this was the study of sites, looking at the biblical text and saying, does this site description match the biblical text, or is this attribution a little bit of a kind of old wives' tale that somebody stuck on to make sure the pilgrims passed through here? And so he was looking at the landscape, the sites critically. What he wasn't doing, he wasn't looking at the text of the Bible itself critically to assess whether it was historically accurate or not. However, there were people at the same time in the 1850s who were doing that, particularly in Germany. So this biblical criticism was a growing field of scholarship. At the same time, of course, we've got the growing fields of geology and evolutionary theory, also kind of challenging, let's say, the word of scripture as something which is 100% to be trusted literally, in that literal sense. And I think that this is really important to understand that a lot of people have suggested that the PEF is a kind of response to these as a backlash against these scientific advances. But I don't know about that, because you look at where the founders are coming from. They're contained within this progression. They're not aside from it. They're part of that progressive thinking. I think what they're presenting is the PEF as an opportunity to test rather than to try and prove the Bible to be true. It's testing the Bible. And so I see it as part of a part of that kind of progressive, forward-thinking, forward-looking movement, rather than something which is trying to hold on to something in the past. That's on the academic side of things. The first projects were all about kind of information gathering, reconnaissance, kind of feasibility studies, digging down more into Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is kind of the hub of everything, and also the thing which people get interested about. Think about the Ordnance Survey of Jerusalem. Everybody got excited about that. So if you want to raise money for the PEF, let's do another thing in Jerusalem. And that certainly happened. And the other thing that's going on at the same time as that is, of course, the kind of strategic element as well. The Ordnance Survey of Sinai, which took place in the late 1860s, certainly, as well as the academic side of things, also has that strategic element. You're surveying the Sinai, of course, it's going to be of interest. That was a project that we were kind of associated with rather than running ourselves. But in all of these, the key people are all royal engineers. And that is because of George Grove's connection. So they were all leading up to this beast, the survey of Western Palestine. which was a project in the field from 1871 through to 1878, and was then published in the first edition in 1880. And it's not just a map. It's a map, but it's a lot more than that. It's a huge volume of written texts covering everything from the hydrography through to manners and customs, through to name lists, a volume on geology, a volume on flora and fauna as well. It's really an in-depth study of the country as these people saw it and documented it in the middle of the 19th century. Obviously, these people who were working there and doing this were coming very much from that 19th century Western, Victorian, Christian background, and they brought with it all their biases and prejudices. And we have to sometimes remember that they're not going to see what's important that we might see as being important today. So there are gaps, but given that even said, it's still an amazing and complete document of a place and a people at a particular time in history. Now, here we have him, Claude Conder, man we've heard a little bit about prior to me standing up here. He was the main leader of the Survey of Western Palestine, a royal engineer. He was a surveyor, a cartographer, a watercolourist, and an aspiring academic, and he was also a Zionist. His background is also really, really interesting. He came from a Congregationalist family. His ancestors had been artists, they had been social reformers. I think one of his granddad had appealed against the repressive Jewish laws in this country. They'd been abolitionists, and they had also been civil engineers. And so real mixture of interesting and very, very energetic people interested in society as well. And I'm sure that's where Conder's Zionism came from. His work in Palestine, I think, kind of embedded that ideology in his brain, and he was going to go on to become a leading proponent of Zionism in the late 19th and early 20th century before the Balfour Declaration. So this is his team. Here is Conder standing up at the back, looking very proprietorial over the whole affair. Seated on looking at him, on your left, is Charles Tewett Drake. He was not a royal engineer. He was an Orientalist and an academic. And I think the relationship between him and Conder was a little bit tricky. Conder found it quite hard to stamp his authority on Charles Tewett Drake, who was a very experienced surveyor and explorer, basically. He was mates with Richard Burton, who we'll also meet a little bit later. And the other chaps, there's also Sergeant Armstrong and Corporal Black, and they were two of the mainstays of the project. And Sergeant Armstrong is the only member of the team who's there throughout, from start to finish. Okay, this is just a little selection of the material that we have here in the PDF, which gives you an idea of the kind of work they're doing. So this is a field tracing, one of the maps that they would have produced in their tents at the end of a hard day, lots and lots of place names all over it, scribblings out, very, very carefully measured. This is a map of the Jordan River, by the way. So going from Beth Shan, Beisan at the north, and I can't remember if it goes all the way down to the Dead Sea. Now, I doubt it, I don't think so. So it's about half of the Jordan River. In the middle, it's Conder's notebook, basically, with some drawings of some of the monuments that he's coming across, and then a really measured plan showing the kind of very careful detail that some structures were given in terms of plans and architecture. Okay, now so the summer of 1872, Charles Tewett Drake catches malaria, we think, and he dies in Jerusalem. So Conder is left without a number two. And he suggests his old chap friend from cramming school, Horatio Kitchener. And Kitchener is seconded to the PEF, and he comes out. And this is a letter from Conder writing to Walter Besant in the November of that year. How do you like him, by? He's a good companion, but not a beauty. So there you go. That's Conder's opinion. And then we also bump into Richard Burton, who's a member of the PEF, and he's writing from Syria, where he's doing various things in Syria, including wrapping up Charles Tewart Drake's affairs. And he talks about Charles Tewart Drake, perhaps things shouldn't be published and some things should go to his mum and all sorts of stuff like that. And he ends off by saying, "Saw Kitchener en route. Your nice young fellow won't last." Well, there you go. He got that wrong, didn't he? Now, in the following summer, 1875, the survey team are attacked at a village called Safed, and we'll hear more about that. The upshot of it is that Conda is very, very badly injured and has to leave the leading of the survey team. And he spends the rest of the time during the course of the survey working on the publications. And he does that here at the Royal Albert Hall. And we have letters with Royal Albert Hall kind of note heading on it. And the reason, this is a new building. It's right next to the Royal College of Music, isn't it? Which was established by George Grove. So it's all about connections. And they needed the space to lay out all their big maps and plans to put them together. Okay. In 1877, the field work started up again, and Kitchener goes out, this time leading the survey. And there are people in the PEF, people like Charles Wilson, who by this time is a really important person on the PEF's committee, who like Kitchener's style a lot. They like the fact that he sticks to the job and he doesn't do this and he doesn't do that, he just does this. Conda had a bit of a habit of kind of going off on tangents and hypothesizing about this and that and t'other. But Kitchener just did what he was told. He was maybe that event did rub off on him, and he didn't go off piste too much. But he kept to the letter of the law. And this was something that other Royal Engineers like Charles Wilson appreciated very much. What happened was that this kind of led to a bit of a falling out between the two men. So whereas they had worked brilliantly, and Conda was full of praise for Kitchener, particularly after the Safed affair, when Kitchener went out again, there seems to have been some kind of disagreement, and Conda feels that Kitchener is basically stealing his thunder. He's taking credit for work that he had done, and he feels very, very strongly about this. We also have a letter from Kitchener's father, who says here, "I do not think it unlikely that other engineers might not object to cast a stone at him. You see, he has gone right out of their groove." This is in 1883. By this time, Kitchener is a major, Conda is the captain, so he's not far, he's not doing badly, but, there is a trajectory. I don't think that Conda was jealous of Kitchener for his military success. I think he wanted to protect his academic reputation. So I don't think that Kitchener's dad had it quite right there. However, that be as it may. So before I hand back to Charles, let's just have a little look at Conda's legacy. Because, here we are talking about Kitchener and the Survey of Western Palestine, whereas actually it is in fact it was his project at the end of the day. He was the one who contributed the most, both to the fieldwork and also to the publication process of this amazing body of work. So he conducted also the survey of Eastern Palestine. By the early 80s, he was able to go back into the field, and that's really what we would describe as Jordan today. And he was the principal author and compiler of both the Survey of Western and Eastern Palestine. And in addition to this, he published lots of really popular books. And these books definitely helped to kind of raise the profile of the PEF in people's minds as the kind of go-to organisation for academic research, for reliable knowledge about this land, Palestine, about the Holy Land. And he remained on the PEF's executive committee until his death in 1910, having reached the rank of brevet colonel. So maybe, he didn't do too badly. Fine. And now I'm going to hand back to Charles. There you go.
Well, thanks, Felicity. That was a tour de force, in terms of the subject we're dealing with. Okay, let's get back to my little discussion of Kitchener, or Herbert as I'm going to call it, in so he arrived, as has been stated, 1874 became his professional home for 4 years, and his first real work as a commissioned Royal Engineer. So he hadn't had any experience as an officer up till then. The Palestine Exploration Fund had been founded in 1865. You've heard all this scientific research into the physical evidence for the chronicled biblical sites, a learned society. He was in very frequent contact with the elders of the society, particularly Walter Besant, the secretary. And you've heard about the nature of the survey of Western Palestine was to produce ordnance survey quality maps and related extensive information about the names and origin of all the important sites and the remains, together with a photographic record. So he was a very accomplished photographer and published a large memoir of photographs. The reason why the British government maintained its secondment program was also for the collateral, political and intelligence gathering possibilities of the PEF being active in the Ottoman-controlled Palestine, literally just a bit smaller than Wales. But it was this crossroads that I think Felicity is well described, goes back a long way. I mean, the Ottoman Empire, Napoleon had his eyes on it. Germany wanted to expand its imperial influence. Russia was coming down from the north and very opposed to the Ottoman Empire. There was a war there, which I won't go into detail on. And Russia was always wanting Constantinople. It never happened. And there was some tension, actually, throughout all this, which is recorded, between these, let's call them intelligence gathering, non-academic objectives and the actual academic objectives. Of course, the non-academic objectives can't be written down. They were sort of word of mouth. So we have no real clue, and certainly I'm sure that Herbert Kitchener would never have written stuff. There's no record of how much of this, but I think he was deeply curious and noticed what was happening around him, and he was feeding that back on various, because don't forget, they did come and go. He came in as number 2 to Condor, who had, the number 2 himself had died, the gentleman who had been number 2. But Condor had already done 20 of the 26 sheets that make up the maps. So, but he picked up the work, so he was going to, quote, finish the job. He had very high spirits. As I said before, he'd learned Arabic and Turkish. He worked as a team of 2 officers and 3 corporals, a clerk, somebody called a dragoman, which is an Ottoman Turkish word for an interpreter and a guide, and a variety of local helpers who presumably would rotate as they went around the countryside. They did all of this on horseback and mule over partly desolate and not so desolate terrain. They were camping. This was real rough camping. The survey work was based on a technique known as triangulation. You're aware of this. You can look at one of these theodolites in the museum next door. And he started in the south, and he increased the rate of progress from 76 to 200 square miles a month. So I think, let's just put a finger on it, I think he's a really hard-working, thorough person. And in fact, that was the family motto. It appears on a lot of our literature in the Kitchener Scholars Association. And this is one of the values we try and pass on to our scholars, this question of being thorough, stick to the task, do your job, take an interest in the detail. So although, of course, Condor and he, I'm sure they respected each other greatly. I mean, they spent months together back in London, putting all of this stuff together. So I suspect that some of the more flourished correspondence was a sort of a fit of pique to some extent. They wouldn't have been able to work all those months in the Albert Hall and in the Royal Geographical Society. They hung out when they came back in that Kensington area, which near the Albert Hall, which had become the learned part of London. Still is. You look today at the Imperial College campus down there, it's absolutely incredible. Anyway, as they went on, they switched their area to the Dead Sea area. Herbert got malaria. They were always getting some sort of sickness there. But they completed the survey in the south, in Beersheba and Nazareth. And then Conder nearly drowned while swimming. Kitchener saved his life at that moment. And he was very grateful for that, obviously. And then in the summer of 1875, they had moved north up to the Galilee area. And they were in a town called Safed, where a local mob attacked them. They were doing their survey work. Not sure what the background to that is. One would have to. I don't get a good feeling of that from reading. It was just a local flare-up of some kind. Sorry?
We can help.
Okay, well, that would be good to drill down on that. I think they were probably resentful of both the Turkish presence and the English Christian explorers. So that was a sort of explosive mixture to see the dragoman on the Turkish side and the Christians being the officers of the army. Anyway, Conder was very severely injured at that point in Safed, and Kitchener shielded him because they weren't using firearms, although there were firearms around. They managed to defend themselves. Kitchener himself was hurt quite badly, but got over it, and he played a decisive role. They were put on trial, the people who had attacked them, and they were fined heavily. Later on, about a year or so later, Kitchener went back to Safed, and he made a plea that the fine be reduced in a magnanimous way, so that he expressed some sympathy for them. Anyway, that incident where Conder was seriously hurt led to a complete suspension of the survey for a period. And the whole of 1876 was spent with Kitchener and Conder writing up the notes, the 12 volumes you saw on the slide. And although that resentment kept cropping up, as I said before, I think they were working together pretty well. He also published an album of photographs, and the PEF quarterly report said that the work had brought home materials of far greater importance than expected. Now here, he must have been talking about the whole episode. In 1877, Conder remained in London, still not well. Kitchener went back and was made commander of the survey, so he was now in charge. And he personally surveyed 1,340 square miles. And then, this is slightly controversial, he revised another 1,700 square miles of Conder's work. Now, obviously, that would have been a possible area of disagreement. But nevertheless, later, as they edited everything, Conder would have been in the driving seat again at that point. So I think, again, they managed to agree what was to be put in the official record. He also continued to deliver military intelligence and political insight. And here's a little extract from 1877, the PEF annual general meeting. At the meeting, the committee expressed a high sense of Lieutenant Kitchener's ability and zeal. He had conducted the work for 6 months without any accidents during a period of suspicion and excitement. His reports are careful and intelligent, and his monthly accounts show due regard for economy. That's the thing, he never stopped all through his life. When he was in very senior Secretary of State for War, etc., he was all had his eye on the money. In fact, it said here, he managed to conduct the survey for a monthly sum less than the budget. And at this time, war did break out between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, and Britain stepped in to support Turkey. And Herbert was very happy because he felt it protected the PEF and its activities. And he knew that the area could become and would become a contested area and was critical to the security of the Suez Canal. By September 1877, they finished the survey. Herbert went off to Bulgaria for another one of his little excursions to witness elements of that war that I mentioned. So later, in 1878, they finished the work, but it took until 1880 before the map and the related memoirs were ready for publication. And in the meantime, he was asked to go to Cyprus, where he became a surveyor there for a period. Won't go into any great detail there. It was an archaeological success, but he fell out with General Wolsey, who many of you know the military history of the period. There were two great generals, Roberts and Wolsey, and Kitchener was more of a Roberts man. And he fell out with Wolsey, and he tried very hard at that moment to get into active service. So he was successful in getting a commission in Egypt, and the rest of his career then took off for the next 20 years. So that's all I've got to say about this element. I've got a few slides here just to... That's an example of one of the finished maps. It's one of the more variegated ones with some some water, lake and mountains. This is the sort of relief map that they produce. And these, I think one or two of them might be able to be observed.
Yeah, we've got some of the field tracings.
We've got the field tracings, which the next one is a field tracing. This is a Kitchener sign field tracing, with again, a bit like the one you had with another one. I'm going to have some of those on display. And here again is one of these drawings that he made of one of the fortresses, and there they are. This is this picture which appeared in small form. Got the feeling that this sort of chintzy print was a sort of interior wallpaper, because the tent itself would probably have been tarpaulin. But I think they amongst themselves said, we can make life a bit more comfortable inside. And here is Herbert Kitchener smoking a pipe, his legs stretching halfway across the tent. This business of not being a beauty, I mean, that's not a statement that I can sort of really judge, but I would have thought he's one of the more handsome people you could wish to meet. But it might have varied according to his age.
I think Conrad wanted to I think Conrad liked being top dog.
I think by any standards, from all the photographs we've seen of Herbert Kitchener, you're talking about a pretty impressive physical specimen, to say the least. But anyway, from here, he went on to this amazing career that perhaps on another occasion we'll go into more detail. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for our two terrific speakers. Would you like to come up? We have a few minutes for just one or two questions. We're not going to extend the questions very long because it's already quite late, and we can certainly continue over a drink in a few minutes. But if anyone likes to lead off.
Sorry, my wife. Can I start?
Go on.
So were the Ottomans happy for a British survey
Exactly what I was
team
gonna
to
ask.
be out there surveying?
This is a really good question, and it's something that I feel that perhaps we don't know as much about as we should. There's somebody I'm talking to at the moment who wants to research this particular question, a Turkish student who wants to do this. I mean, the Ottoman, I think you have to split it down as well in terms of which Ottomans are you talking about, because you've got your Ottomans in Constantinople, who are kind of sitting there up there somewhere, and then you've got your Pashas in Jerusalem, in Beirut, in Damascus, who are the guys that they're dealing with much more locally. And certainly they are sometimes very anxious about the work that is being done, not necessarily from a kind of political point of view in terms of, kind of an international policy, but local politics, particularly the Pasha in Jerusalem, was very, very nervous about Charles Warren's work, the project that took place in Jerusalem before the survey. And if you think about it, this guy was going out and digging holes all around the Haram al-Sharif. And it's like, oh, do we really want these British guys digging holes here? And one of their contemporaries, a chap called John McGregor, who was also an explorer, wrote in the PEQ, our quarterly statement, that, how would we feel, or how would the Archbishop of Canterbury feel if a bunch of Ottoman Turks came along and started digging holes in the lawn outside of Westminster Abbey? Yeah. It's that kind of thing, and the kind of the local tensions, the religious feeling about the Haram al-Sharif. They were very conscious of these things, and sometimes I think they found the PEF's work difficult, and so the PEF explorers had to be good at negotiation, about getting along, about trying to make sure that they didn't rub people up the wrong way.
Was there any kind of quid pro quo sharing of the information?
Oh yeah. The Sultan got a copy of the survey.
Oh, okay.
I think, remember that in those days, Britain was the most powerful political force in the world. And the Ottomans were not keen on the Russians. And Britain put its hand up to say, well, don't worry, we'll support you. So that was at the nub of the imperial pact, as it were. And in fact, Britain got away with a lot of things, like we, in this period, took over Cyprus, and then invaded Egypt. And that became effectively run by the British. And Kitchener, that's where his career took off, as he became Commander-in-Chief fairly few years later, Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Army, and then Governor-General of Sudan. And this career really took off from this base that he established. But I think there was a very special, unique relationship with the Ottoman Empire during its, what's the word? It's the sick man of Europe. It was failing, and they needed the protection. I think Britain got away with a lot.
And of course, the alliance with Germany was what finally dealt with that.
Yes,
possible
mortal blow. So
yes.
Just behind.
I noticed earlier on in this slide, bottom line saying that to prevent the PF from being bankrupt. This was all part and parcel of bringing about generating income from that side.
Very much. The PEF has never been funded by government or an external body of that sort. It's always been independent. And as such, it's always relied on donations and sometimes the odd donation from another society like the Royal Geographical Society. And we were always about to go bust.
But there was a phenomenal... The reason I think it was swept along in Victorian times was that there was a huge interest amongst it in a religious society.
Okay, there was another one. I didn't
we
have the
another
last question, I'm afraid.
It was the same question, because I was going to ask whether, particularly the survey work, was funded by the government, or whether it was public subscription.
Public
I'm
subscription.
very impressed with the public subscription.
Yeah.
The very strategic operation.
I think the key is that it appealed to so many different interest groups. So it wasn't just, the Reverend's own particular thing over here, or that person's wish to understand the genus of the adder snake better. It was a whole gamut of things. And so therefore it kind of, we've got letters, some of the letters in our archive that refer to the founding period. And we've got one letter that says, I can't believe I'm sitting on the same committee as him. So people who held really, absolutely opposite views of the world. But this area really galvanised them for somehow.
I would imagine that the salaries of the Royal Engineers were still paid by the War Office.
I'm not sure. I think they were paid by the PEF for this work. Yeah, they were paid by the PEF.
Because that's not covered in the literature I've read.
Okay, I think we've got the accounts, so I think you'll
follow the money.
Yeah.